Good evening.
Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery. This is the weekly monk chat session, your opportunity to ask questions about Buddhism and our opportunity to talk about Buddhism. So if you want us to talk about Buddhism, you can type some questions into the chat window. I see a few people have already put in some questions, which is great. So hello to the people who have already checked in. Hello to Anna Maria, Mystics, Victoria, Kauser Friend, Richard, Bhumika, Maria, and whoever else is watching that hasn't said anything yet. So we'll start with homage to the Buddha, and then we'll see if there's... go ahead and start going through the questions, since there's already questions. So we'll start with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami.
Okay, so hello everyone. And our first question is from Anna Maria. Hope you're well, Anna Maria. Says follow-up question from last week, and similar to Richard's question from above, which we don't see. So Richard, if you sent a question, you'll have to retype that. She says, I know we're responsible for our choices, but do we create karma if we're aware of the mind's tendencies? This is from last week. She asked a related question about...
So... I'm not quite clear what you mean by do we create karma if we're aware of the mind's tendencies? So, awareness, awareness of the mind's tendencies. If one is actively cultivating awareness, so one is making the choice to be aware, the choice to pay attention to and be aware of the mind's tendencies, then that choice is karma. And that choice is the karma that creates wisdom, in fact. So actually one of the ways that we create wisdom is through observing the mind. You don't necessarily need to control the mind, you can just observe the mind. Just watch as the mind goes through its crazy antics. And that watching, observation of the mind's movements starts to cultivate wisdom. The wisdom which, first of all, understands the non-self nature of the mind. This is actually really important. Much of what appears in the mind, we think, oh, this is me, I am these thoughts, I am these emotions, this is me doing this. But actually, if you just sit back and watch, you'll realize that about 99% of what goes on in the mind is autopilot. And the autopilot is absolutely insane. Like it's the kind of autopilot that goes around deliberately running into pedestrians and things. So you're watching your mind on autopilot and just observing like, wow, this mind is absolutely insane. That's a good thing it's not me. It'd be really depressing if it was me. Good thing it's not. And also watching the mind going around, you'll also recognize the mind is not stable. The mind is not persistent, it's not permanent, it's not fixed, it's constantly bouncing around and doing different things. So this is also giving you a glimpse of anicca, the non-persistent, non-stable, impermanent nature of mind. So that also is cultivating wisdom. And again, all of this, you're not actually doing anything, you're just choosing to pay attention. You're just choosing to be aware of what the mind is doing. Watching the crazy clown show in your own mind. And as you do so, you'll also start to notice that there are mental activities which you are not participating in, which is most of them usually. And there are mental activities which you are in fact getting involved in. You are participating in. You are actually actively creating them to some degree. And that's where you need to be very careful. So just watching the crazy clown show is not creating bad karma. In fact, it's creating good karma because you're cultivating the faculty of awareness and the faculty of wisdom. But when you notice that you're actually creating certain tendencies of mind. You're actually actively involved in generating certain mental activities. Then that's where you need to be very careful. Because if you're creating wholesome thoughts, wholesome emotions, well, then that's good. That's good karma. Whereas if you're creating harmful thoughts, harmful emotions, then that's bad karma. So through observation and awareness, you can learn to distinguish. First of all, distinguish between volitional and non-volitional mental activities. And again, most mental activities are non-volitional. We're just watching the show. It's not who we are. It's not something we're doing. We're just watching the crazy show. And then the things which are volitional, you divide them into wholesome and unwholesome. There's also neutral. So beneficial, harmful, and neutral. So the beneficial you want to preserve, maintain, build up. Harmful you want to reduce. And the neutral mostly doesn't really matter. It's pretty irrelevant for the most part. So again, I'm not quite sure if I actually answered your question. So Anna Maria, if I missed your point, if you could put in a follow-up. Okay?
Okay. Just didn't lose you put anything else, just check. And so then we have a question from Victoria. It says, good evening, Venerables. How did the Dhamma find you in the first place and at what age? I often hear stories about why people become monastics, but I'd love to hear about your first eureka moment that put you on the path in lay life. Was there a teacher that you heard or read that you can credit for that experience?
Can you show the first part of the question again?
Yeah, sorry. She's saying, what age, how did you find the Dhamma in the first place and at what age? And then hearing about, was there a teacher or something that you read that you credited for finding that enthusiasm?
Well, if you specifically mean Buddha Dhamma, I was 17. And I had already been engaged in spiritual search for several years at that point. And one thing that I periodically heard people talking about was meditation practice, but I didn't really know much about it. And so I started reading online about meditation practice and found out that meditation is present in many different religions and many different spiritual systems, but one religion where meditation has a very important part was in Buddhism. So that got me interested in learning a bit about Buddhism. So I started reading about Buddhism online and I was blown away. I was like, this stuff is absolutely amazing. This is exactly what I was looking for. And in the beginning, I was particularly drawn to Zen Buddhism, particularly Soto Zen. And one of the most transformative early books for me was Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shunryu Suzuki Roshi. That was a book which really gave me the sense of like, oh, okay, there's something here. That the Buddhist path really does offer an incredibly profound way of training the mind and developing the heart. Something which is not just like a surface level 10% happier, 10% calmer kind of thing. Or just some kind of trippy, far-out psychedelic experience, but rather something that actually could bring about the complete realization of absolute truth and the experience of ultimate happiness. So that's where I would put it for. And then from there, it just kept building up momentum, and within a couple years, I decided I wanted to be a monk. How about you?
Well, for me, I would say the beginning was probably, I found it through meditation as well, actually, if I recall correctly. So I was interested in Taoism and other forms so I was reading like the Tao Te Ching, it's a Chinese philosophy book, and similar books like the Zhuangzi, so different books they're considered Taoist books that many people know, and I found those really helpful, like the contemplations on impermanence and contemplation on, like, one of the best things in there is Zhuangzi says that everyone knows the usefulness of useful things, but no one knows the usefulness of useless things, right? So he talks about being useless, like a tree which is useless, it actually lives the longest because no one wants to cut it down. And then it has the biggest shade so you can relax under it. So things like that, and also contemplating like the death and so on. So I found that like very inspiring and helpful. And then I got into martial arts, Chinese martial arts. And in those, we practiced a form of Taoist meditation, form of kind of breath meditation, working with it was focused around developing different ways of working with chi, because I was doing a martial arts system. So it was kind of, it wasn't for, I would say, it wasn't really for any kind of spiritual ultimate purpose. It was more actually in service of martial arts. But it was also recognized, like, in order to do this properly, you have to be able to relax. You have to have a calm mind. You have to have control over your body and mind, and in a way that's relaxing, not a way that's forcing anything. So that was actually an introduction to meditation. And so then I would practice the way we were doing it. There was several steps to it. And I would go home and I would sometimes practice meditation I just found it a little bit, I found it naturally just to breathe, like just to practice breath meditation. So we were practicing a form of breath meditation that required like moving the attention around the body and so on. And instead I would just when I would practice meditation, I would just practice normal breath meditation. And I didn't really receive instructions on it. I think we received instructions on breathing in and out, but I think I just found it like, I can just sit here and just breathe. I don't need to do all these exercises. And and usually what I did, I would read like a passage, for example, from the Tao Te Ching, or a passage from a spiritual book, and then I would maybe light a candle or something, and I would meditate in my room. And sometimes I would meditate, in just different scenarios. And through that experience through practicing meditation, I was like, what is this? And I looked, and that's when I started looking, and I found out about Buddhism, because I found, Buddhism has very clear descriptions Buddhism talks about meditation. And I was like, wow, that's really cool. And then later on, I also found there was a guy who was a martial arts, he was in the lineage that I was in, and he was visiting from another area, and we had a martial arts tournament. And so we were in my teacher's basement, and at a certain point he said like, oh, I sleep on the floor, because the Buddha recommended it. And I was like, you know what? I want to sleep on the floor. So then I got rid of my mattress and I started sleeping on the floor. And then later on, I realized he was talking about the 8 precepts. But I remember that was also part of it. Like, there were several different touch points where I found Buddhism and I was really inspired by it. And I felt like Buddhism is true. And I would practice also mindfulness and things like that. But most of it was kind of mixed with like Taoism. It wasn't very specific. But that's the seed that later on was able to sprout into more focused practice. Okay, and the next question, lots of people joining in. Richard Vesaka says, independent origination, avidya is the condition of Sankara. What means that as long as we have the sense of self, we make karma, right? And what does it mean that Sankara is the condition for Vijnana Namarupa? Does it mean that according to our karma, the 6 types of consciousness, the stream of consciousness, are established in one realm of existence of samsara, for example, the human realm?
Can you go back to the first part? So let's see, independent origination of vijja is the condition of sankara, which means that as long as we have the sense of self, we make karma, right? So, well, actually, the phrase avijja paccaya sankara, I mean, it's only 3 words, but there's a tremendous amount of incredibly profound meaning packed into those 3 words. So saying as long as we have the sense of self, we make karma, that's part of what it's talking about. So avijja is normally defined as not knowing the 4 noble truths, not knowing the 3 characteristics. So and then based upon that fundamental ignorance, that fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of reality, then there arises sankharas. There are sankhara. And then we have to talk about what the word sankara means, which might take some time. So the basic thing again is that when we don't understand the nature of reality, when we don't understand how our desires create suffering, when we don't understand the impermanent, unsatisfying, and impersonal nature of all things, then based upon that, there are sankhara. So Sankara has a few different meanings depending on context. The 2 main meanings of Sankara, well, there's 3 main ones, but 2 of them are relevant here. So one is Sankara in the sense of mental activities. So mental activities that we engage in. So that, in this case, it would mean mental activities based on ignorance. So mental activities based upon the delusion of self-existence, or the delusion of persistent phenomena, or the delusion of conditional happiness. Based upon that, we engage in mental activities which are rooted in those fundamental misunderstandings. The really critical one here being, of course, the delusion of self-identity. And the other meaning of Sankara is Sankara has the meaning of a distinct phenomenon. So any distinct phenomenon, any distinct object, any distinct thing, whether physical or mental, whether concrete or abstract, can be called a Sankara. So again, when the mind is caught up in delusion and ignorance, then it fabricates the idea of persistent, ongoing, real objects and phenomena. So it concretizes Sankara, concretizes the perception of persistent Sankara. So the first way of understanding Sankara here is more emphasizing the anatta side. So when the mind doesn't understand anatta, it formulates a sense of self-identity and acts based upon that sense of self-identity. The second one is more emphasizing anicca. When we don't recognize the anicca characteristic, when we don't recognize the non-persistent nature of things, then we tend to create the idea of persistent, ongoing objects, ongoing sankharas. So these are two different interpretations of avijja paccaya sankhara, and both have certain degree of valid justification. And ultimately, in the end, it actually winds up meaning basically the same thing. So it sounds like two different interpretations, but they actually mean basically the same thing in the end. And then, so then this is talking about the beginning of the formulation of a sense of self. And then based upon that, then there's the creation of self-identity and specific. I am this consciousness, I am this body and mind, and so on, which is the vijnana nama rupa thing. So I am this awareness, I am this body, I am these mental objects and activities. We think, oh, this is my persistent, ongoing self-existence. It's defined through these thoughts and emotions and these body sensations and so on. So that's all avijja paccaya sankhara, sankhara paccaya vijnana, vijnana paccaya nama rupa. And then from that, then there does come the reification of self-identity, which then leads to ongoing rebirth and samsara. I don't know if that was sufficiently clear or not. Let's see.
Establishing a realm.
I think that covered everything he asked about. Did I miss anything here?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in terms of establishing, I mean, one of the ways that the Buddha talks about vijnana and namarupa in terms of establishing, he says namarupa paccaya vijnana, and he asks Ananda, like, what is that? How should you understand that? He says vijnanam lahyananda namarupe patitang nalabhisata apinoko ayating jati dhammarang dukkha samadhya sambhavopanyayatati. He says, if vijnana wasn't established in namarupa, would there be the production of future rebirth, old age, and dukkha? And Ananda says no. So it's station, like patitita is usually the translation of stationed. So definitely that word is used, that concept is definitely relevant.
Okay. See the next one.
Sean says, I am a nurse who frequently works very long days, often in a row. I try to sit for meditation, but often in these stretches I cannot give enough time to do it. Other than keeping to the precepts and practicing the 10 perfections, would you recommend ways to advance my practice and develop qualities that may be less obvious?
Well, one thing that I would really encourage is on days when you feel like you don't have enough time to meditate, first of all, you do. That's just a story you're telling yourself. But when you say you don't have enough time to meditate, well, then still do some devotional chanting. Kind of the standard Swiss Army knife of Theravada Buddhist chanting is the recollection of Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. So you chant the Namo Tassa 3 times, and then Itipiso Bhagava Arahang Samma Sambuddho, etc. So the recollection of Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. And as you do that, remember the meaning of the words. Remember the qualities of Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, the admirable, praiseworthy qualities of Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, cultivating a sense of reverence and respect and appreciation for Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. And even if that's all you do for the day, maybe that's all you think you have time for. Again, you always have time for more than that, but maybe that's all you think you have time for. Well, that's still good, because then you're still reminding yourself of Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha and cultivating an attitude of respect and reverence and appreciation for them. Okay?
And Sud says, ever since last Friday or Saturday, I've increased my meditation with objects being metta. After 1.5 to 2 hours of meditation, I get so fatigued I actually have to go to sleep. Is there a way to avoid this? Any chance I'm doing this wrong? There is no deep jhana. How can I best know if I'm doing this right or wrong?
So it sounds to me like you're trying too hard. Just relax. Just relax. So cultivating metta doesn't need to be something forceful. Actually, generally speaking, meditation doesn't need to be forceful. In fact, usually trying to practice meditation in a forceful, effortful way winds up just making things worse. It winds up just making the mind agitated, intense, and uncomfortable. And it can lead to exhaustion, because it's a lot of work to constantly try to force the mind into a particular shape. So instead, you want to practice in a more relaxed, gentle way. Sit in a comfortable posture. You can even let yourself slump a little bit. Like, it's okay if you're not sitting up ramrod straight all the time, especially for long periods of meditation. It's okay to relax your physical posture a little bit. Droop your eyes, bring up a little smile on your face, take a few deep breaths. Then with those relaxed eyes and that gentle smile, then you start slowly, gently introducing the metta thoughts into your mind. So thinking like, oh, may Teddy be happy. Oh, little buddy, may he be happy and safe. May no harm come to him. May he develop wisdom and serenity. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So slowly cultivating these attitudes in the mind. And anytime you start to feel like you're really bearing down on the meditation, stop. Stop trying to meditate. Just take a few deep breaths. Bring up that soft smile again. Come back to your body. Just focus on enjoying being present with your body. And then, when you're ready, you can start slowly, gently, calmly introducing the metta thoughts again. But if you're practicing in a way that's actually producing fatigue, then that's usually a sign that you're trying too hard and you're putting too much force into it. So I would probably recommend that you practice in a more relaxed, easygoing way like this. Because you're definitely not going to get into deep jhana if you're either tense or fatigued. Yeah, it's not going to work. The mind needs to be relaxed, yet awake. Alert, yet peaceful. Okay?
Okay. And Cows Our Friend says, any tips for timekeeping while meditating for a long time? I get restless not knowing how much time has passed, but feel like regular signals would prevent concentration.
Yeah, Cows Our Friend, what I recommend is to sit for 3 or 4 hours straight. So set your timer for 4 hours and resolve not to get up until it goes off. And make sure that the clock is not anywhere where you can see it, because it's just going to be really depressing when you look at that clock and realize it's only been an hour and a half and you still have another 2.5 hours to go. So just resign yourself to the eternal present. Resign yourself to the fact that the meditation period will never end, and that's perfectly fine. Resign yourself to the fact that this is your entire life. Sitting still on this cushion doing nothing, that's your entire life. Hallelujah, that sounds great. So resign yourself to that fact, and you'll just stop worrying about time, because time becomes meaningless. So This is one of the benefits of doing really long periods of sitting, is that at some point you just give up entirely, waiting for things to end, because it will just feel like it's never going to end. And then eventually, usually long after you've given up any hope that the meditation will actually end, eventually the timer will go off and you'll be like, oh, that wasn't so bad. But yeah, regular signals, I don't recommend it. Set your timer to go off at the end of the meditation period, whether it's 5 minutes or 4 hours. Set the timer to go off at the end, and that's it. And just wait for it to end. Okay.
And Gauss Eternal says, long time back, Ayurveda talked about investigating boredom in meditation. How do you do that? Do you observe the feelings, assuming you don't want to engage in thinking?
Well, I don't know what you said about boredom, so maybe you can... Do you remember saying something about boredom?
Maybe like a long time ago. I think it was just that if someone's bored in meditation, then they can observe it, so because that cures the boredom.
Yeah, I mean, that's a standard method.
Yeah.
Yeah, observe the sensation of boredom. Observe the emotion of boredom. I mean, I don't know. I haven't been bored in meditation in so long. Yeah, I mean, how could you
one way is
possibly be bored?
I mean, one thing to look at is like, why are you bored exactly that way? You know, like, why are you bored? Because that's the thing. I think also many people, I feel that in the modern time, there's a misunderstanding about meditation. There's just a deep misunderstanding. It's like this activity that you do to get what you want. But it's like the Buddha is very clear. Meditation is a function of renunciation, and it comes after a long part of training. So meditation, like the Buddha's meditation method, takes about 5-6 pages to extend, and it starts with virtue. And then he goes into sense restraint and being mindful in your daily activities and like living in a way which is simple and contentment with very little things, and then removing the hindrances from your mind. So it's very like extended, and the whole point is, Buddha says, if you don't see the danger and drawback of sensual pleasures, then you can't attain something, deep meditation, basically. Because so that the idea is like, in why are we bored of meditation is because we're interested in something else. Well, you don't cure that most of the time. How do you cure that? You cure that with how you live your life. Like if you're really interested in doing something else, then in your life you have to start learning to be interested in simplicity. You can't cure that, generally speaking, in just a general period of meditation. So like, let's say that you're really bored because you'd rather hang out with friends, you'd rather watch movies or listen to music. Well, you're not going to solve that. The problem is you haven't been reflecting properly your whole life, your whole day, likely for many, many lifetimes. So like that interest has to be dried out. So the Buddha gives the simile of wet sticks. He says like, if these sticks were wet, even if they were outside of the water, then you couldn't light a fire with them. In the same way, if the mind is interested in sensuality, it's just not possible for it to experience joy of renunciation. So I would say like, why are you bored? And then looking at that and also seeing sometimes like, oh, boredom is an obstruction to happiness. So then we cure it by engaging in sense pleasures. But then that engaging in sense pleasures is a constant chase, which is unsatisfying, and then we can't meditate. So you can reflect on the drawbacks. That's another way of dealing with boredom. Like, why am I bored? Because I'm interested in something else. That's the only reason you would be. Because you don't get bored when you're doing things you like. And then thinking, well, why do I like those things? Why am I interested in those things? So that's one way also of investigating, which is a little bit different from maybe the standard way, but I feel that's really important. Because it's like people, they're meditating, if there's no success happening, probably it's because you're interested in something else, which you're not practicing virtue and sense restraint and mindfulness in your daily life.
Yeah, and just to really emphasize that point, that so boredom itself doesn't exist in a vacuum. Boredom is actually the product of either desire or aversion. So either desire for something that's not currently happening. So maybe you're sitting there and you start thinking about your hobbies that you really want to do and would much rather be doing than sitting here doing nothing. So then what's causing the boredom? The boredom is desire to go and do your hobbies. Or sometimes it's aversion. You're sitting here and there's maybe a body sensation that you don't like, or there's an emotion that you don't like, or there's some recurrent thoughts that you don't like. So then the mind is like, well, if I was distracted with some other activity, then I wouldn't have to face this uncomfortable sensation. So then boredom can arise in that case from aversion. So look to see, what is it actually? There's not really any such thing as boredom. So we use this word, but it doesn't actually exist. When you look closer, you will only ever see desire or aversion. So Ayurveda was speaking a moment ago about desire as a basis for boredom. So you can see, is it desire for something in particular? Then you can reflect, has getting that ever caused permanent, lasting, absolute satisfaction and happiness? The answer is, of course, no. Or if it's an experience that you haven't had, you can think, if I did get that, would it actually bring permanent, lasting, perfect happiness? And generally speaking, the answer is also no. Unless your desire is for awakening, but that's a different thing to talk about and doesn't usually lead to boredom. And then aversion, again, looking, what is it that you're averse to? Usually it's some aspect of your current experience that you want to escape or cover up. So pay attention to whatever it is you have aversion towards, and just give full, accepting, loving attention to whatever it is. Is it a body sensation? Well, just give your full, accepting, loving attention to it. Like, this is how your body is, and that's totally natural, and it might be like this forever, and that's totally okay. Or if it's your mind, if there's some emotion or thought pattern present, well, just give it full, loving, accepting attention. Oh, this is just how the mind feels. Well, okay. Give it permission to feel this way. It's just like if you have a cat who's in pain, or a small child that's suffering, and you're just like, it's okay, little friend. It's okay, I'm here for you. I'm here with you. So you just give that same loving attention to your own mental experience, whatever it is that's uncomfortable. Just accept, this is just how it is, and there's nothing wrong. And then again, the boredom will disappear. Once you fully accept whatever it is you're averse towards, then you stop being aversive towards it, and the boredom evaporates. Okay?
Okay. And Yongcho says, did Buddha ever get frustrated on his disciples? If so, how did he handle his frustrations?
Well, it depends what you mean by frustrated. So there's a few places in the suttas where the Buddha talks about his disciples not doing what he wants them to do. But he also makes it clear that he is not personally bothered, because his mind is perfectly peaceful and happy, because he's removed all desire and aversion from his mind. So the compassionate activities of the Buddha are just something he does because that's what Buddhas do. But whether or not people actually follow his instructions, he's not bothered one way or the other. So I wouldn't say he's frustrated. I mean, the sense I more get from the sutras is he's more kind of resigned. He knows that only a certain small percentage of people are actually going to follow his instructions. And the rest are just going to roam helplessly through samsara for a few billion lifetimes, but that's their choice. There are those who choose to follow the Buddha's instructions and those who choose not to. So the Buddha just shares the instructions. There's a sutta where somebody actually asked the Buddha, why is it that some of your disciples attain awakening and some don't? And the Buddha replies with a question. He's like, well, do you know the way from here to Savatthi? Which was a major city in the area. And the person says, yes, of course I know the way. And the Buddha says, what if somebody asks you how to get to Savatthi? Can you tell them? And the person says, yes, of course I can tell them the way to Savatthi. The Buddha says, what if the person ignores your instructions and goes in the opposite direction? And the guy's like, well, what can you do? All I can do is tell them the right way. And the Buddha's like, well, in the same way, I tell people the Dhamma, but it's their choice whether or not they follow it. So all the Buddha can do is point out the way. So the sense I get is that no, the Buddha was not the least bit frustrated. He was perfectly aware that a large percentage of people were not going to follow his instructions. But nonetheless, the function of a Buddha is to give those instructions. So that's what he did.
There's also some places where he dismisses the Sangha and gets convinced to go back, which are kind of funny.
Well, I think there was an underlying motive there.
Yeah. There's one place where the Buddha, it says he dismissed the Sangha, and then he's reflecting like, actually, there's a lot of junior monastics who would probably benefit from me being there. And then he goes back and he talks to, I think, Sariputta and Mahamoggallana about it. And he says, "What did you do? Or what were you thinking?" And Sariputta says, "Oh, I was thinking that the Buddha has gone into retreat, so now we'll just be silent. Like we'll just practice silently now. We won't be teaching anymore." And Mahamoggallana thought that the Buddha has gone away, so then he'll start teaching, taking over. And the Buddha was like, "Yeah, that's what you should have been thinking." So yeah, there are places like that. And there's also places where he tells his disciple, he gets, I would say, not frustrated like Bhante said, but his disciples say something wrong. So like there's a couple places where they have very wrong views that they hold to, and he says, he calls them a mogha buddhisa, so a vain person or a foolish person, a silly person, like. And he also says,
like idiot. He's like you idiots.
So he's very clear, actually. He really doesn't like it, like in the sense of, obviously we wouldn't say he's averse, but he's very clear, like that's not good to do. He says it very strongly. So
What's more that a Buddha knows when to use gentle speech and when to use strong words. He says as much in, for example, the discourse to Prince Abhaya, Abhaya Rajakumara Sutta. He says a Buddha knows when to use disagreeable speech. So the Buddha would sometimes speak in ways that seem quite harsh and severe and rude. And other times he would speak in ways that were quite gentle and kind. But it was all coming from a place of compassion. It was him knowing when was the right time to use which kind of speech. Okay, let's keep going.
okay. And this looks like okay.
That's a good question.
It says, how can I get better with my patience?
Wait. That's the only way. Just wait. This is another thing which really long periods of sitting meditation are good for. There is nothing to do except be patient. As you're waiting for that timer to go off, knowing that it's going to be hours and hours, just wait. Give up hope. There is no hope. There is only the present moment, and in the present moment there is only peacefully waiting. Resign yourself to the reality of the present moment. You cannot change the present moment. All you can do is accept it. So just relinquish any hope for the future, relinquish any desire for different conditions in the future. Just fully accept the present moment feels exactly the way it does. And that's totally fine. Nothing wrong here at all. If you cultivate that attitude, then you'll become very patient.
Okay. And Victoria says, in the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha talks about using your wealth for offering to devas. Can you explain a good way to go about doing this and what the benefit of doing so is?
Well, I always understood that as he wasn't actually saying that we should give offerings to devas, but rather he was saying how there was a common custom of people making offerings to devas. And that there wasn't something wrong with it. It's not that people had to stop doing it. But I don't think of anywhere in the suttas where he actually says you should make offerings to devas.
I think there might be some places where it's kind of like said that it's good, but I don't think that it, like maybe some poems and so on, but it's not, I definitely don't think it's a big theme. Maybe it's, I agree though, that's how I've always read it though, that it's like, I don't think it's one of the Buddha's major teachings, like, oh, you should make offerings to, to devas, it's really important, but rather that, yeah, I think the sense that I always got was the same, even though there might be some places where he talks about that. Like actually in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, I think there's a section where it comes up like, but yeah, I always took it in the same way, Bhante. It's like the Buddha is saying that by offering to devas, by the way though, but I guess she's also asking how would you go about doing that. The way that it's going about is though you're not offering it literally to them, assuming that you can't actually do that, can't actually see them, then he's referring to leaving offerings at like an altar. So people often leave fruit at deva statues, often even to this day, in many different religions. That's what he's referring to, generally speaking.
Yeah, and it's a way of cultivating respect for devas. And in the suttas, when the Buddha talks about respect for devas, he's specifically talking about respect for the wholesome traits and activities that they cultivated in previous lives that led to being reborn as devas. So this is the important distinction. So when one is respecting devas, one is respecting the wholesome karma that they made in order to be reborn as devas.
And Brian says, Venerables, do you have any recommendations for determining in meditation practice when mental phenomena are objects to let pass through versus signs that point toward larger patterns of unwholesome behavior or habits that require more intentional responses and transformation?
So, I talked a bit about this earlier. So when observing the mind, the first thing to look for is whether the mental phenomena that are appearing is whether they are volitional or non-volitional. In other words, are they just echoes of the past appearing of their own accord in the mind? Or are they things which you're actually actively generating in that moment? That's the first thing to check. So if it's just something that's appearing of its own accord, then just don't get involved in it. Just let it do its thing, and it will just float through the mind. And there's no problem as long as you don't participate in it, as long as you don't try to hold on to it, as long as you don't get aversive and hostile towards it either. As long as you maintain mindfulness and equanimity, then non-volitional mental phenomena will simply appear, drift through the mind, and then disappear. And there's no problem at all. In fact, that's just cultivating wisdom, as I was mentioning earlier. But when you are noticing that you are actually participating in generating or maintaining a mental phenomenon, then that's where you need to look more closely. Is this wholesome or unwholesome? Is this beneficial or harmful? Is this in accordance with Dhamma or not in accordance with Dhamma? And if you notice that you're actually intentionally engaging in unwholesome mental activity, then that's when you need to stop. So either just stop, like literally just stop, take a few deep breaths, come back to your body, or deliberately produce wholesome mental activities instead. Can be something as simple as reciting the Buddha's name, or doing chanting. So whatever chanting you've memorized, you can just keep reciting it silently in your mind. Or out loud. If you're by yourself, then you can do chanting out loud. Actually, I remember being on long personal retreats in monasteries, and every day I would do tremendous amount of chanting by myself, sometimes 2 hours of chanting by myself. And I found it absolutely delightful, doing 2 or 3 hours of chanting on my own. For one thing, you're always in harmony. You never have to worry about harmonizing. I found that a delightful way to keep the mind from getting into trouble. If you're sitting in a room with other people, then you do it silently in your own mind, just reciting, chanting over and over again. That's another example of producing wholesome mental activities, so that you stop getting caught up in unwholesome mental activities. Okay.
Okay. And this person says, I've heard that there is an unbroken chain of arahants leading back to the Buddha. Is there any validity to this? Any studies or records you can recommend?
Oh man, I wish that was true. But I think it's highly unlikely, to be perfectly honest. Actually, if you look at Buddhist history, what you see is cycles of degradation and reform. And currently we're in a cycle of degradation, by the way, in my opinion. There was a strong reform a few decades ago, and now we're into the degradation cycle, which is unfortunate, but not surprising. Hopefully there's another reform coming. Maybe we're the leading edge of the reform. So there's actually been periods of time in Buddhist history in various countries where the monastic sangha died out entirely. There were periods of time where there was basically no one who was practicing meditation. There were periods of time where in various, again, you have to kind of track the history of each Buddhist country separately. And in every Buddhist country you see similar things. Periods of time where no one's meditating, no one's studying the suttas, no one's following the precepts. The periods of time when the monastic orders disappear entirely, or if they are present, they're just engaging in useless rituals, or caught up in local superstitions rather than studying the Dhamma. And then after a while, someone is like, well, maybe we should try actually studying and practicing Buddhism for a change. And then people get back into Buddhism, and then when there are people who are really sincerely studying the suttas and practicing the instructions found in the suttas, then you start to get people attaining awakening again. So I personally think it's quite unlikely that there have always been arhants in an unbroken chain going back to the Buddha. I think that's quite unlikely. I think that was probably true for the first few centuries of Buddhism, but not since then. But I do think that there have periodically been times when there were people who were practicing diligently and attaining awakening. And there might be some today, in fact. There might be some awakened beings in the world today. But I don't think there's necessarily always been since the time of the Buddha. Okay? And studies or records, definitely not. Because one of the things about awakened beings is they don't normally go around telling other people that they're awakened. So the records are mostly non-existent. And in fact, where there are records, they can't really be believed. So like if you go on somebody's website, like www.confirmedarhant.org, and it's like, hello, my name is John Smith, certified arhant, that's an absolute surefire guarantee that they're not awakened. Okay. So no, there's no records to be found on these matters.
The Buddha said, wherever there's the Eightfold Path, then you can find enlightened beings there. So if people weren't practicing the Eightfold Path, then they would be around.
Yeah.
And Richard says, I'm doing an experiment. Since August 2022, I have meditated 3 to 5 hours daily because I believe in that way I will get jhana in 5 to 10 years. But I'm starting to get tired and want to meditate less. What are your opinions?
Well, first off, my opinion is that you're being way too mathematical about this. And second, it's really important to understand that the main determining factor in how well your meditation goes is what you're doing the rest of the time. Of course, what you're doing during meditation periods does matter. Right? If you're just sitting there thinking about how much you hate your life, then you're not getting jhana anytime soon. Or if you're just sitting there thinking about how disgusting and awful everything is, again, you're not getting anywhere close to jhana. So what you're doing during meditation does matter, but what you're doing outside of meditation matters just as much, if not more. So, realistically, if you really want to have any chance of getting jhana anytime soon, it's very difficult to do it if you're not a monastic. That's one thing I'm just going to say flat out. There's a reason why monasticism has always been at the heart of Buddhism since day one, and still is. So, one, it's very difficult if you're not a monastic, and that's because monastic life is about renunciation. And Buddhist meditation is about renunciation. So if you're not living a life of renunciation, then your meditation practice is always going to be shallow. If you're really dedicated, then you might possibly get jhana at some point. But it's going to be a real uphill battle the entire time if you're not living a life of renunciation. And also jhana normally only happens during long periods of retreat. And it's for the same reason, because long periods of retreat are creating these supportive conditions for the mind to become extremely quiet and settled. So it's, again, creating external circumstances of renunciation. So the rare occasions I know of lay people experiencing jhana, it's inevitably during long retreats. So it does happen, but it's not common. And normally it's only during retreat. So practicing in your everyday life, it is possible, but the rest of your life needs to be a life of renunciation, quiet, peace, simplicity, a life without constant triggers for desire and aversion. And for most lay people, that's just not the way they're living. Like I remember years ago, I was talking to someone who was, well, first he was going on about how he had all 4 jhanas and domain of infinite space and domain of infinite consciousness, and he's working on the domain of nothingness, and I'm like, okay, yep. And then he was telling me how he goes to raves on the weekends. And I was like, aha, oh really? Aha. So you're going to raves on the weekends, but you still believe that somehow you're getting jhana the rest of the time. And of course I talked with him a bit more, and it was clear that he was just extremely delusional, that he didn't even have first jhana, let alone the domain of infinite space. And that's because, once again, his life was not a life of renunciation. His life was a life of sensuality, a life of agitation and distraction and confusion. And his meditation practice was just an extension of that. It was just an extension of that same distracted confusion that he was doing with the rest of his life. So, again, meditation it's 90% what you're doing when you're not meditating. So it really, really can't be emphasized enough. If you want to get anywhere close to jhana, you have to live a very quiet, simple, peaceful life with the bare minimum of desire, aversion, agitation, distraction, confusion. You want to minimize that as much as possible. Okay?
Yeah, I feel like another thing here is maybe like, if you imagine that you want to lift you want to do a deadlift competition where you lift a 300-pound weight on the stage, and you're like, okay, I'm going to get some 10 weight dumbbells and I'm going to lift them for 3 hours every single day, and by the end of a 10-year period, I'll be able to lift 300 pounds. And it's like, well, it doesn't work that way, does it? Lifting 10-pound dumbbells for 5 hours a day doesn't get you to lift 300 pounds in 10 years, because it's not mathematical in that way. So you have to go, okay, I'll lift 10 pounds, and then can I lift 20? And then can I lift 50? And then you build up gradually. And that's how the Buddha, so I feel like also there's this mentality sometimes of like, so we want to be here, but we're actually here. And so it's like, okay, how do I get here? But actually there's a stairway. So like the Buddha says, like, what is the condition for jhana? It's removing the hindrances. And it all comes down to, basically, he gives different sequences, but he says, okay, well, what is the first thing? You need faith. Out of faith, then you need to be glad. You need to develop a happy mind. And then you need to be virtuous, develop a mind without regret. And then you start to develop a mind that has ecstasy, and then after you get that, then you can start to develop more soothing pleasure, and then start calming your. So there's many steps that the Buddha lists in order to get to jhana. Like, he doesn't go, okay, you sit down and then you get jhana. He gives like a whole thing. And so it's kind of like, if we start treating it as like, oh, I'll just lift these tiny weights without thinking like we need to actually incrementally go up, you'll never actually get at the larger number. Even if you lift a 10 weight pound 10 million times, that won't lead to being able to lift a 300 weight pound. It doesn't, because it doesn't work that way. So you have to gradually build each step. So it's like, well, what is the next step? Instead of thinking like, what is 10 steps from now? What is the immediate next step? That's what you should move to, I feel. Not the next 10 steps later. Because you can't get there by focusing on, by just doing what you have. You have to build up gradually.
Yeah, and the other thing is that when building a structure, the most important part is the foundation. So one way that this is described is that, so jhana is like the ground floor of the building, and vipassana is the pinnacle. So in order to build the pinnacle, the insight, then you need the ground floor, you need jhana. But in order to build that, you need a strong foundation underneath it to support it. So without a good foundation, then you're not going to be able to build a solid jhana practice. And without a solid jhana practice, then you can't build the pinnacle of insight, of vipassana. So our mind is like a swamp, and in a swamp it takes a lot of time to slowly build a really strong, sturdy, stable foundation. If you just try to go directly to putting a skyscraper in a swamp, then it's just going to collapse. So the foundation, actually the very simple foundation is serenity. Just sitting peacefully doing nothing is building up the foundation of serenity, which is one of the factors of awakening, and it's also one of the necessary characteristics of jhana. Just sitting there and watching the mind do its crazy antics while you're building up mindfulness and wisdom, which again are necessary components of jhana, and also are two of the factors of awakening. So slowly constructing a foundation. And the stronger and more stable your foundation gets, then the easier and easier jhana becomes, the more accessible it becomes. And eventually it will just happen on its own. When the foundation is completely done, then jhana will just happen by itself. It doesn't actually take any effort at all. Our practice is 99% foundation building. The rest just kind of comes together on its own. The rest is mostly just the natural emergence of having a strong foundation combined with right view. Okay.
Okay. And then we have a question from Victoria. It says, referring to my previous question from Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, further, householder with the wealth thus gained, the noble disciple makes the 5 kinds of offerings to relatives, guests, ancestors, the king, and the devas. This is the third case of wealth come to good use.
Yeah, that's just an example of ways of using money well. Like there, if I recall that sutta correctly, the Buddha's just giving the example of good ways of using money. So if you're a lay person and you want to use your money well, then you use it to help other people and to make offerings to spiritual practitioners and make offerings to devas and so on. So it's cultivating that religious mind, that mind which appreciates something which is beyond the ordinary. Okay?
Yeah, the devas don't get many offerings nowadays in this country.
Yeah, it's a bit sad.
Yeah. People make more offerings to the gambling machines and phone apps and so on, I think. Okay, in Sutta Nipata 2.2, Buddha says it's okay to eat meat, but doing recitation in religion, ritual, and seasonal observation is carry-on stench. Can you explain? Can you please explain the word ajena? Because this sutta really contradicts the Mahayana sutta on Buddha name recitation and not eating meat.
Do you want to talk about this one?
Sure, yeah. So I think this is referring to the Amaganta Sutta, the sutta on sometimes translated as putrefaction, here translated as carry-on stench. Actually, though, it's not, by the way, I don't think it's attributed to the Buddha, it's attributed to Kassapa. And there's a disagreement. I believe that the tradition, actually the sutta itself, says that this was spoken by Kassapa Buddha, though that's, of course, a little bit questionable, because how would we have access to that sutta? And in fact, it's actually likely that the poem was some other poem that was introduced into Buddhism. But we don't need to talk about that. But just like many poems in Buddhism, you actually will find them elsewhere. Because the thing is, there was poems circulating at the time that spiritual practitioners would discuss, and they had different interpretations of them. So they don't actually need to be from Buddhism to be Buddhist. But in terms of, so eating meat, so what the sutta is talking about is someone is accusing a monk of eating meat, and they're saying like, oh, well, you have all these values, but actually you just eat this rotten flesh. And then the monk is saying, he's basically retorting to that, and he's saying like, well, actually, being greedy, that's rotten flesh. That's the stench of rotten flesh. That's disgusting. Not eating dead meat. Not eating meat, that's not actually itself unethical. So he's making an argument. He's saying that eating meat is not inherently unethical, but there's actually many other things which are actually disgusting and unethical, which have the stench of disgusting flesh. So that's kind of the question, that's what's going on. And the point is that when the Buddha was asked about eating meat, he said that he does not eat meat or allow his monks to eat meat, which has been deliberately killed for them. And so the point is, as alms mendicants, as people who eat alms food, then if someone has dead meat in their house that they cook, and a monk happens to pass by, and they give them the meat, the point that the Buddha made is that they didn't kill the animal, they didn't ask the animal to be killed, they didn't encourage the person to kill the animal, they didn't contribute to the killing of the animals because it was already dead and cooked and so on. They just received what someone gave out of generosity. So the point is actually they're allowing that person to make good karma, and they're not themselves participating in the act of killing. But other people, for example, performing rituals with wrong view, so thinking that performing rituals in and of themselves that don't actually lead to awakening, thinking that leads to awakening, well, that's actually wrong view. So teaching that and practicing that will actually be misleading. It'll actually lead to suffering, like lots of suffering, right? In this life, it won't achieve success. Also, it will mislead people, and also it will lead to bad rebirth, because eventually you'll get reborn. You won't escape. So that's actually very dangerous. Whereas just receiving the generous gifts of others without contributing to killing, the point in the sutta is that that's actually not something that's inherently unethical. Of course, it's also worth mentioning, though, that that sutta itself, it's really the only place where an argument is made in such strong language. So usually the suttas are actually quite ambivalent about eating meat. Like they don't go out of their way to say, yeah, everyone should be eating meat, it's totally fine. Actually, they just kind of say like, well, if we receive it and it wasn't killed for us, for the monks, it's okay. But it doesn't usually go into an argument like, yes, it's okay to, it doesn't defend the meat industry or anything like that. In fact, the Buddha says that dealing with animals is wrong livelihood. And also nowadays, people have made the argument, which is, of course, an opinion, and some people would disagree. But some people make the argument that in the time of the Buddha, the meat industry was different. So, for example, there were no such thing as factory farms in the time of the Buddha. And there are stories in the, I believe it's the Vinaya, where someone wants to get some meat, and it turns out that in the entire city of Savatthi, there's no meat. So, like, imagine that you go to New York City and there's just literally no meat in the entire city. Because in that time, they didn't have an industry where of kind of surplus based on increasing the production based off the quantity that was desired in a large industry. It was more like there were a certain number of animals that farmers had a regular process of butchering and so on. That's what it seems to have been. So it's less likely, basically, that by someone accepting meat, that they would have been contributing to that. But nowadays, if you have a local building, like you have a local temple, and you tell everyone that you accept meat, probably people will start buying more meat to feed you. So the difference is that in the time of the Buddha, one, monastics were wandering, so they were less stable. So generally speaking, it would be less predictable if a monk was coming in the area, meaning that the meat was less related to the monastics. Like, people were less likely to be buying it for them because they'd just be passing through. And then also the meat industry itself was much different in nature. So it's also good to at least keep that in mind. You know, it's not that the argument that the Buddha makes doesn't stand, but it's also good to keep in mind, like, well, what is it really? Are my intentions unwholesome, unethical in contributing to buying meat? Because the point in the sutta is that the monk himself doesn't have that, and he's being accused of something. He's being accused of being a hypocrite. So it's a very contextual sutta. It's a contextual argument between a monk and a person who's accusing him of doing something unethical.
I would just add to that it's also interesting that there's a Vinaya rule where normally we aren't allowed to directly ask for food, especially to directly ask for specific kinds of food. But there's an exception. If one has a medical need, then one can directly ask for meat, fish, dairy, and a few other specific foods. So this is interesting, that not only was meat not prohibited for Buddhist monks, but that we were actually allowed to specifically ask for it if we have a medical need. So this does occasionally come up. So again, most people are perfectly capable of surviving on a vegetarian diet, but a small percentage of people, it's really difficult for their body, and from time to time it's necessary for them to have a little bit of animal products for the health of their body. So it's actually built into the Vinaya that if we feel like we really need it, and again, this means not just you want it. It's not just like, I'm really craving a cheeseburger today. Like, it has to be like you really feel like your body is suffering because it's not getting the right nutrition. And you really believe that animal products will give your body the nutrients that it's lacking. Then in that case, we're actually allowed to directly ask for meat, fish, dairy, and a few other specific things. Okay. As for the Mahayana Sutras, I mean, it is good to keep in mind that the vast majority of the Mahayana Sutras were clearly composed several hundred years after the Buddha's death. A handful of them may have been composed earlier, but still almost certainly after the Buddha passed away. So yes, there are a couple of Mahayana Sutras that say not to eat meat, but those are apocryphal. So I wouldn't take it too seriously.
Okay, and TJ says, in what way is emptiness related to interdependence and dependent origination?
So, so when we talk about emptiness, normally this is the translation for the word sunyata. So in the suttas, the word sunyata is directly connected with anicca and anatta. So things are called empty because they are empty of self and they're empty of persistence. So phenomena arise and immediately cease. So they have no persistent existence. In that sense, they can be called empty. And nothing whatsoever is me or mine. So in that sense, they can also be called empty. They're empty of persistent existence, and they're empty of self. Interdependence, is there actually a clear Pali term for interdependence? I guess Paticca Samuppada you could translate as interdependent arising if you wanted to.
I think
So
the closest,
Paticca has that sense of interdependent.
I mean, dependent on,
Yeah.
not interdependent, but I think the closest would be like the certain conditions in Paticca but not all of them. Like namarupa pacha vijnanam, vijnana pacha namarupam. So that one is actually interdependent, but not all of them are like that. Like feeling, craving doesn't condition feeling directly in that way, like in this life.
Yeah, but there is the clear sense that everything in samsara is connected to everything else. Like nothing exists in a vacuum. Nothing exists independently of everything else. Like everything's part of this vast interlocking web of causes and conditions and of causality. And that's then connected to the idea of emptiness, and that things are constantly arising and ceasing. And in their arising and ceasing, it creates the causes and conditions for other things to arise and cease. So in that sense, everything is constantly contributing to the arising of other things, but each individual thing has no persistent existence, and therefore is empty. And also it's empty of independent self-existence. So that also connects to the idea of everything being empty of self.
Yeah, there's actually a sutta. So in the Sarvastivada canon, so in the Agamas we have in Chinese and some Sanskrit, they actually have several sutras. Like for example, one is called the Paramartha Shunyata Sutra or something, and it has a parallel in Pali. It's just not called that in Pali, because in the Nidana Samyutta, for example, the chapter on dependent origination, the Buddha several different times in various different ways, he says that, so we know the middle path, the Majjhima Patipada, is one of practice. So it's between two extremes of sensual indulgence and indulging in pain, bodily pain. And he also calls Paticca Samuppada, so dependent origination, he also talks about that in a way that's between two extremes, but it's not in terms of practice, it's in terms of philosophical view. And several times it comes up that Paticca Samuppada is between the extremes of eternalism, so the idea that there's related to what Bhante was saying, a persistent, ongoing, everlasting essence or substance in us, or in the world which we're part of or contributing to. So the idea that I exist, I will exist forever, I will continue existing, or I'm part of a larger cosmic substance which is ever eternal. And the other extreme is annihilationism, that we will cease to exist at death. There's nothing in us, there's no continuity, everything will just cease. It's just everything will just cease to exist. And the Buddha says that the Buddha teaches the Dhamma between these two extremes. And that is dependent origination. And so the point, though, that he makes several times, the reason it's between eternalism and annihilationism is because we're not annihilated. It's not that we cease to exist, because actually there is continuity. It's described because Buddha describes how rebirth happens. But it's not eternalism because it's without a self or a soul that's going between lives. So like when people ask, what is it that's reborn? That is answered many different times in the suttas on dependent origination, because that's one of the main purposes of the teaching. Specifically is to describe how can there be rebirth, how can there be non-annihilation without a soul, and how can rebirth end without anyone being annihilated. So there's nothing that continues, but yet there is a continuity of existence, and yet there's nothing that's destroyed, and yet it can cease. Because the point is that existence, it manifests when the conditions are there, and it doesn't manifest when the conditions are not there. So it doesn't actually go anywhere. It's just like, it's a pure manifestation or apparition that doesn't have a self within it, but yet it continues. So the Buddha talks about dependent origination in that way. One of the ways he talks about it is that he says, like for example, someone asks him, who is it that is, like, what is old age and death, and who is it that has old age and death? And the Buddha says that is not a valid question. And he says that if you have the view that the soul is the same as the body, or a view that the soul is different than the body, tan jivang tang sarirang, anyang jivang, anyang sarirang, then it's not possible. It's not possible to live the holy life. It's not possible to become an arhat. And he says that he teaches in the middle between these two extremes, which is dependent on rebirth, there is old age and death. So the point he's making is that, and this is what's called the Paramartha Shunyata Sutra. So this is the same Pali Sutra that's called about emptiness in the other agamas. So the point is that there are conditions. There's a relationship between two things, but there's no essence or substance or self which is in there or which is equal to them. Like they just arise when the conditions are present, and it doesn't arise when the condition is absent. But there's no actual thing in there. There's no substance. It's empty of a self, and it's empty of something that owns it. It's empty of belonging, and it doesn't have any permanence because it can arise and cease, as Bhante said. So if I check the SN 12.35 and 12.36 are specifically about that. Also SN 12.15 is a very famous one where the Buddha talks about this and also non-self. And also then SN 12.17 and SN 12.18 where the people come to the Buddha and they say, for example, is dukkha sayankatang dukkha? And the Buddha says, mahewam, don't say that. So is dukkha self-made? Is it made by ourselves? So the Buddha says, don't say that. They say, parankatang dukkha. Buddha says, well then is it made by someone else? And Buddha says, mahewam, don't say that. He says, sankatancha parankatancha dukkha. So is it made by ourselves and other people? And Buddha says, mahewam, don't say that. He says, asyankarang, aparankarang, aditya samuppanang dukkha. Well then, dukkha, suffering, is not made by ourselves or anyone, it just arises randomly without a cause. And the Buddha says, mahewam. He says, well then, does dukkha not exist? And the Buddha says, no, atti dukkha. Dukkha exists. He says, well then, na janasi, na pasasi. You don't know or see then. His Buddha says, no, he does know and see dukkha. And so dukkha arises due to certain causes, which are not a self. They don't belong to ourself. They don't belong to someone else. They're not a creator God or created by a soul or anything like that. And it's not random. It's actually, it's conditioned. It's dependent. And the simile the Buddha gives of this is like a flame. So imagine that you have a wick and you have wax and you put a spark to it. Well, does the flame have to fly over from the nearest fire to the wick? And then it stays there, and then when it goes out, it has to hide away somewhere else? Or does it just, when the conditions are ripe, the flame just manifests, it just appears. It doesn't come from anywhere, and it doesn't go anywhere when it goes out. And a flame it's a process. So like, for example, when the wax runs out and the flame disappears, there's nothing in there that was destroyed. It wasn't annihilated. It's just that the process for the manifestation, the appearance of the flame, is no longer, the conditions are present. But nothing was destroyed. And that's what the Buddha talks about when he's talking about dependent origination and emptiness.
It's also an interesting metaphor because we talk about a candle flame as though it's a persistent object, but actually it's, as you mentioned, it's a process. It's actually something that's very obviously in constant change. There's nothing persistent, because that's the other point here, is that there's nothing that continues from moment to moment. Rather, it's that the conditions in one moment create the possibility for something to arise in the next moment. But there's not actually something that continues, that moves from moment to moment. Okay, let's move on. It's getting late.
Okay.
And there's still a few questions.
Okay, Yongchu says, I don't quite understand the translation of vipassana to be clear seeing. Is it clearly experiencing the three characteristics when in jhana state?
I mean, that is a big part of vipassana. Yeah, it's clearly saying anicca, dukkha, anatta. Not just in jhana, but all the time. Like in your daily life, see everything as unstable, unsatisfying, and impersonal. And allow the mind to relax into a state of equanimity without desire or aversion. So that also is vipassana. Okay?
And Scott says, Ante, I would like to renounce as much as possible in daily life. Busy times will come. Many duties. How might we have success to not be burdened by many duties so that our meditation is supported?
Scott, you're choosing these duties. You're choosing to get involved in these things. So choose to live a simple life. Choose to live a peaceful life. Okay? People love to make excuses for their complications. Just stop complicating your life, and then it becomes less complicated. Like, and it blows my mind. People they have this whole idea of like, I am a busy layperson. It's like, no, you're not. You're doing busy layperson. Just stop doing busy layperson. Okay.
Yeah. Also, hello, Bhante.
Oh, hello, Bhante.
Okay. And Nick looks like an extension. I was reading there are 4 different translations of Ajhena Kuttang. Because Sujato translates it as learning crooked spells, while Lawrence Kuntipala Mills translates it as studying crooked views. Norman and Bodhi follow the commentaries in rendering this as useless studies. Tanisura Bhikkhu translates it as useless recitations, and they all mean very different. Would love to hear your translation.
And I remember ajna as meaning more like study. So studying something, crooked or malformed or useless or irrelevant, tangential studies, things which aren't related to awakening. But I'd have to look at the sutta again and see the context, but that's what I remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, I would say, Tanik, that it looks like also the fact that there's different translations and people are referring to the commentary means it's probably an ambiguous phrase.
Yeah.
So I would look at any notes that you can find from people about that.
Yeah. Okay.
And they ask, how important are rituals? I'm inclined to a more secular interpretation of Buddhism.
Well, AGGZ, I have some bad news for you. There is no such thing as secular Buddhism. So if that's what you want, abandon hope. It doesn't exist. If you want to be a secular, non-religious meditator who appreciates some elements of Buddhism, well, you can do that. You just won't be Buddhist, and you won't be practicing Buddhism. If you want to practice Buddhism, well, Buddhism contains many elements in it that other people call religious, and that's okay. People can call it whatever they want. But many of these things are really important. So things like cultivating respect and admiration and appreciation for the Buddha. This is really important. And in Buddhist tradition, this is often done through things like bowing to Buddha statues and reciting traditional verses of devotion and homage and reverence, many of which come all the way from the time of the Buddha. This is really important. It's not to be swept aside lightly. And the value is not always immediately apparent. But through doing it, day after day, year after year, you start to understand how this is a way of training the mind, of transforming the heart. So I recommend, if you really want to get into Buddhism, just get into it wholeheartedly, 100%, including all the religious parts of it. And ask questions. Ask the monks, well, why do we do this? Why do we do that? What's the symbolism of this? What's the meaning of that? Try to understand all of the religious components, because there's a meaning behind it. It's not empty ritual. There's meaning behind it. And it all works to support the training of the heart. So it's actually quite arrogant to come to something that one doesn't understand and just randomly decide to start cutting out bits of it. Kind of like a cat. So you look at a cat and you're just like, oh, he's got this weird little bump on the bottom of his foot. It looks useless, I'll just cut it off. Oh, he's got these weird flaps on the top of his head, probably useless too, I'll just cut those off too. It's like, oh, he's got these long hairs sticking out of his nose, I'll just cut those off, he doesn't need those either. And he's got this tail, tails are clearly useless, we'll just cut that off too. And then before long, you've completely eviscerated your cat, and you don't have a cat, you just have a pile of dead flesh. Well, this is exactly what people do when they try to do secular interpretations of Buddhism. They start cutting off living flesh, and you wind up with something dead and lifeless and useless, rather than an actual living religious tradition that leads to awakening. So just like you don't mutilate your cat, don't mutilate your Buddhism. Okay. Unless you want to add something to that.
I mean, I guess I agree with what you said, Bhante. I guess I would just say, though, like, I guess to balance it out is that, of course, the Buddha did, in fact, talk about how rituals are misleading and so on. So that is part of Buddhism as well. It's important to recognize that. But I think that it's kind of like the medicine, like how, for example, there are some teachings that monks will give to lay people, like, oh, you need to not focus on generosity and not focus on rebirth. You need to start focusing on meditation and so on. And those teachings are precisely the ones that shouldn't be given to people who don't practice generosity. And like, because the point is that it's contextual. So when the Buddha was talking about rituals, he was coming from a place where many people at the time, they were dedicated to rituals. But if you are incredibly averse to rituals and you don't want to practice them at all, probably you should not be focusing on those teachings to a large extent. You should be focusing on, as Bhante was saying, what are the actual wholesome rituals? But the Buddha did in fact criticize rituals. It's just that he said they're not essential. So the Eightfold Path is the practice of Buddhism, not one of ritual. But rituals are a part of that. And often it seems like, as Bhante said, I feel often people, they use the teachings of the Buddha criticizing rituals as ways of actually cultivating, for example, wrong thought and wrong view and other wrong parts of the Eightfold Path, like criticizing others, looking down on others, cultivating a selfish heart, and so on. Not that you're doing that. I'm not saying you're doing that, but so I think that that's also worth considering, that yes, rituals are criticized, but are we using that in the wrong way, grabbing it by the tail of the snake, so to speak, and then kind of getting bitten by that?
And specifically what's criticized is a misunderstanding or wrong application of ritual. So it's not that ritual itself is bad, but rather it's that ritual is a tool that's meant to help cultivate a wholesome mind and a wholesome heart. And learning how to use that tool effectively is an important part of Buddhist practice. Okay, next question.
Polka Ru says, are there any views in Buddhism as to free will or determinism?
A thicket of views, indeed, indeed.
Yeah.
So briefly speaking, in every moment you're making choices, and those choices will determine what happens to you in the future. So in that sense, there is both free will and determinism. Okay, next question.
A.G. Jeezy says, what is the soul?
There isn't one. Next question.
What is it that there isn't, Bhante?
Well, it depends what you mean by soul. If by soul you mean a persistent, ongoing self-essence to each individual sentient being, then the answer is no. There is no such thing.
And Tonic says, what are your thoughts on recitation? The Thai Force tradition also encourages us to recite Buddha, but the Sutta seems to say recitation is wrong.
So actually there's many places in the suttas where the Buddha talks about the value of recitation. So the value of reciting the suttas, the value of memorizing the suttas, the value of constantly examining the suttas. And one of the ways that's done is in fact through recitation. Actually reciting verbally the teachings has always been an important part of Buddhism since the beginning. And the recollection of the Buddha. So recitation of the qualities of the Buddha is again something that goes back to the time of the Buddha. One of the practices that the Buddha recommended is in fact recollection of the Buddha. Recollection of Buddhas actually, it's not specific to him, but the qualities that all Buddhas have in common. So the chant Itipiso Bhagava Arahang Samma Sambuddho, etc. Is a description of the qualities that every Buddha has. Not just Shakyamuni, but every Buddha has these qualities. So a recollection of the qualities of the Buddha. And then in Thailand, that was abbreviated to just the word Buddho. So rather than reciting the whole list of the Buddha's qualities, they would just recite the single word Buddho, which then is meant to evoke in one's mind all the qualities of the Buddha. It's meant to evoke in one's mind the recollection of what a Buddha is, with a sense of deep appreciation and admiration and respect for Buddhas, and also the aspiration to become a Buddha, to become fully awakened just like a Buddha. So it's not just about endlessly reciting a meaningless word, but rather it's about the recollection of the Buddha, constantly reminding yourself of the Buddha. And actually, I really recommend, if one is not already a devoted, faithful Buddhist, I recommend doing the full recollection of the Buddha practice. Instead of just reciting the name, actually recollect the qualities of the Buddha. Recollect the praiseworthy qualities of the Buddha and what they mean. And forming that sincere aspiration to cultivate those qualities in your own heart as well. Okay, any other questions?
Looks like no.
Okay, so I guess we'll go ahead and conclude at this time. So another delightful monk chat. We'll end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.
Have a good night.